55 miles north of Saigon, at a critical crossroads in Phuoc Long Province, 11 American Green Berets were about to face a nightmare that would change the course of the Vietnam War. It was late May 1965, and Detachment A342, 5th Special Forces Group, had just arrived at a remote outpost called Dong Xoai. Their mission seemed routine: train local Montagnard tribesmen and South Vietnamese militia forces, strengthen the camp's defenses, and establish a presence at this vital junction, where roads converge from the north, south, and west. Behind them, the political situation in Saigon teetered on the edge of collapse, creating what North Vietnamese commanders saw as an irresistible opportunity. The camp itself was a work in progress. 9 Navy Seabees from Technical Assistance Team 1104 had joined the Green Berets on June 4th, bringing their construction expertise to reinforce fortifications that were far from complete. These Seabees carried a proud motto: Construimus, batuimus. We build, we fight. Within days, they would prove the second half of that promise in blood and fire. Among them was a 25-year-old construction mechanic named Marvin Shields, a former lumberjack from Port Townsend, Washington, who brought his guitar to the camp and entertained the troops in the evenings. No one could have known that this cheerful young Seabee would soon become the first and only member of his service to receive the Medal of Honor. The camp's commander was Captain Bill Stokes, a seasoned Special Forces officer who understood the precarious nature of their position. Under his command were approximately 400 Montagnard fighters from the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, 200 South Vietnamese troops, including a howitzer battery, an armored car platoon, and the headquarters of the local district administration. The camp was actually divided into 2 separate compounds connected by communication lines. The main camp housed the Montagnard CIDG forces, while the district headquarters building anchored a second compound, where American and South Vietnamese officers coordinated with local government officials. Both compounds bristled with defensive positions, barbed wire, and carefully placed minefields. But the defenses were incomplete, and time was running out. What Captain Stokes and his men didn't know was that 2 full Viet Cong regiments were already moving into position. The 272nd and 273rd Regiments of the 9th Division, comprising nearly 2,000 battle-hardened fighters, had been carefully infiltrating the area for days. They brought with them an arsenal that far exceeded typical guerrilla armament: 60mm mortars, 57mm recoilless rifles, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and even flamethrowers. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. This wasn't going to be a hit-and-run harassment. This was going to be a deliberate assault designed to annihilate the camp and send a message that would echo all the way to Washington. The political context made the timing perfect for such an attack. In February 1965, General Nguyen Khan had been ousted from power in Saigon after failing to maintain support from either the Buddhist movement or the Catholic faction within his government. The resulting instability created a leadership vacuum that North Vietnamese planners believed they could exploit. Their strategy for the summer of 1965 was ambitious and brutal: launch coordinated attacks across South Vietnam designed to destroy regular ARVN units, and prove that the South Vietnamese government could not survive without dramatically increased American intervention. Dong Xoai was chosen as a crucial target, not just for its strategic location, but because its complete destruction would demonstrate the vulnerability of American advisory positions throughout the country. Among the Green Berets settling into their positions on the night of June 9th was 2nd Lieutenant Charles Q. Williams, a man whose background perfectly embodied the American military's approach to unconventional warfare. Williams had served as a non-commissioned officer in the legendary 82nd Airborne Division before attending Officer Candidate School and earning his commission. He had volunteered for the Green Berets, attracted by their mission of working alongside indigenous forces to fight communism in remote corners of the world. Williams was intelligent, resourceful, and possessed the kind of level-headed courage that would soon be tested beyond anything his training had prepared him for. As night fell on June 9th, he had no idea that within hours he would be leading a desperate last stand that would earn him the nation's highest military decoration. The Viet Cong commanders orchestrating the attack had learned their craft fighting the French a decade earlier. They understood that success required more than just overwhelming the camp itself. The 272nd Regiment was assigned to assault Dong Xoai village and the Special Forces compound directly, while the 273rd Regiment positioned itself along every likely route and landing zone that American or South Vietnamese reinforcements might use. This 2nd Regiment's mission was equally important: ambush and destroy any rescue attempts, turning what should have been a relief operation into a killing field. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered plan that anticipated every possible American response, and it was about to be executed with terrifying precision. Inside the camp, the Americans had placed their forces on heightened alert. Intelligence reports suggested increased enemy activity in the area, though the specific nature and timing of the threat remained unclear. The Green Berets had trained their Montagnard charges well, and the CIDG fighters manned their positions with quiet professionalism as darkness settled over the jungle. The South Vietnamese troops checked their weapons and ammunition, while the howitzer crews ensured their 105mm guns were ready for action. In the district headquarters building, radios crackled with routine traffic as officers coordinated with regional command centers. Everything seemed as normal as it ever did in this dangerous corner of South Vietnam. But less than 100 meters from the camp's perimeter, Viet Cong soldiers lay in perfect stillness. They had crept into position with extraordinary patience, moving through the jungle in the dead of night, avoiding American patrols and surveillance. Some had been in position for hours, others for days. Mortar crews had carefully ranged their weapons, calculating the exact trajectory needed to drop shells onto the camp's communication center, ammunition storage, and command posts. Machine gunners had selected their fields of fire with precision, ensuring that no part of the camp would be safe from their deadly crossfire. Assault teams clutched grenades and satchel charges, ready to breach the wire and swarm into the compound. Officers synchronized their watches and whispered final orders. Every man knew his role in the coming storm. At 11:30 p.m. on June 9, 1965, the jungle erupted in fire. The first shells hit the camp with devastating accuracy. 60mm mortar rounds arced through the darkness and plunged into the Special Forces compound, followed immediately by the sharp crack of 57mm recoilless rifles tearing through defensive positions. Within the opening minutes of the barrage, the Viet Cong gunners achieved what they had planned with such meticulous care. They destroyed the camp's primary communication equipment and obliterated the medical dispensary. Cut off from outside help and unable to treat casualties in their designated aid station, the defenders were already fighting at a severe disadvantage before the first enemy soldier entered the wire. Captain Bill Stokes was running toward the command bunker when the world exploded around him. Shrapnel from a mortar round tore into both of his legs, sending him crashing to the ground in blinding pain. As the camp's commander struggled to remain conscious, the weight of defending Dong Xoai suddenly fell on younger shoulders. Second Lieutenant Charles Williams grabbed a PRC-10 portable radio and tried desperately to establish communication with other positions in the camp. The radio worked, but barely, and Williams quickly realized the nightmare reality of their situation. The camp's defenses were being systematically shredded by an enemy force far larger and better equipped than anyone had anticipated. The Viet Cong assault came in waves that seemed endless. The initial mortar barrage had been calculated to suppress defensive fire and create gaps in the perimeter. But the Americans had anticipated this tactic and dispersed their forces accordingly. Montagnard fighters opened fire from prepared positions, their weapons cutting down the first enemy soldiers to reach the wire. But the Viet Cong came on with terrifying determination, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through the barbed wire obstacles and sappers to clear paths through the minefields. The mines did take a toll. Dozens of enemy soldiers were killed or maimed by the carefully placed explosives, but for every Viet Cong fighter who fell, 5 more pushed forward, their AK-47s hammering away at defensive positions. The scene inside the camp became a hellscape of fire and death. Tracer rounds crisscrossed the darkness, creating a web of lethal light that made any movement potentially fatal. The Viet Cong employed weapons that few Americans had encountered in such concentrated fashion. Rocket-propelled grenades slammed into bunkers with bone-rattling explosions, while heavy machine gun fire swept across open ground with mathematical precision. Most terrifying of all, were the flamethrowers. Viet Cong troops armed with these horrific weapons advanced on defensive positions, sending jets of burning fuel that turned men into living torches and forced defenders to abandon otherwise strong positions. The screams of burning men added to the chaos, creating a psychological weapon as potent as any bullet or shell. At 1 a.m. on June 10th, with the camp under increasingly desperate assault, help arrived from the sky. The 3rd Flight Platoon of the 118th Aviation Company, known by their call sign Bandits, scrambled 2 UH-1B Iroquois helicopters from Bien Hoa Air Base, roughly 20 miles south of the battle. Chief Warrant Officer Ralph Orlando was among the pilots who raced through the darkness toward the sound of gunfire. What he saw when he arrived over Dong Xoai shocked him even after months of combat operations in Vietnam. In his diary, Orlando would later write that the town and compound were in shambles, with at least 7 50-caliber machine gun positions scattered throughout the area. He watched in horror as the Viet Cong used flamethrowers against the camp's defenders and sent human wave assaults crashing against the perimeter, in a display of coordinated violence that seemed more characteristic of conventional warfare than guerrilla tactics. The bandit gunships immediately opened fire, their door gunners and rocket pods targeting the heavy machine gun positions that were shredding the camp's defenses. But as soon as they began their attack runs, enemy gunners shifted their attention skyward. The helicopters were immediately bracketed by ground fire from multiple positions, forcing the pilots to weave and jink violently to avoid being shot down. The gunships expended all their ammunition in a frantic effort to suppress enemy fire, achieving some success in silencing several machine gun nests, but the sheer volume of Viet Cong fighters made it impossible to turn the tide of battle. After emptying their weapons, the bandits were forced to break contact and return to base, leaving the defenders to face the onslaught alone. On the ground, Lieutenant Williams was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, simultaneously. He was directing what remained of the camp's defensive fire, trying to establish reliable communication with higher headquarters, coordinating the evacuation of wounded men to safer positions, and attempting to maintain some semblance of organized resistance despite the complete chaos surrounding him. The Montagnard CIDG fighters were proving their worth, holding their positions with remarkable courage even as casualties mounted. But at 2:30 a.m., approximately 3 hours into the battle, it became clear that the outer perimeter could not be held. The CIDG force was crumbling under the relentless pressure, and American personnel from both compounds were in danger of being overrun and killed or captured. Williams made the hardest decision a combat leader can make: order a withdrawal. He directed all American personnel to consolidate their position at the district headquarters building, the most defensible structure in the compound. Green Berets and Seabees scrambled through enemy fire, carrying wounded comrades and whatever weapons and ammunition they could salvage. Sergeant First Class James T. Taylor, Jr., a Special Forces medic, helped carry the severely wounded Captain Stokes to the headquarters building, working alongside Marvin Shields and another Seabee. The fact that they made it through the maelstrom of fire was nothing short of miraculous. Dozens of Montagnard fighters and South Vietnamese troops fought their way to the headquarters building as well, determined to make a last stand alongside the Americans who had trained them. The district headquarters building now became a fortress within a fortress. It was a solid structure, better built than most of the camp's facilities, and it offered cover from small arms fire and fragmentation. But it was also surrounded, cut off from any hope of immediate relief, and packed with wounded men who needed medical attention that was simply unavailable. Someone managed to get a battery-powered radio working, providing a tenuous link to the outside world. When Williams raced to the communications bunker to use this radio, he was hit by grenade fragments that tore into his stomach and right arm. These were his 4th and 5th wounds of the battle, but the young lieutenant refused to stop. Bleeding from multiple injuries, Williams used the radio to direct airstrikes from Air Force planes that had arrived overhead, bringing the fury of American air power down on Viet Cong positions that were inexorably closing in on the building. The situation was beyond desperate. The camp had effectively fallen. The outer perimeter was in enemy hands. The Americans and their remaining Vietnamese allies were compressed into a single building, surrounded by perhaps 1,000 enemy soldiers who were methodically working their way closer. Communications were sporadic at best. Medical supplies were exhausted. Ammunition was running low, and dawn was still hours away. The defenders had no way of knowing if reinforcements would arrive in time or if they would all die here in this remote jungle outpost. Just another footnote in a war that was about to escalate far beyond anyone's imagination. But even in this moment of maximum desperation, acts of extraordinary courage continued to unfold. Marvin Shields, despite being a construction mechanic whose primary training had been in building things rather than destroying them, fought with the ferocity of a seasoned infantry soldier. He moved from position to position, firing his weapon, helping coordinate the defense, and maintaining a spirit that kept other men going even when hope seemed lost. Lieutenant Williams, bleeding from 5 separate wounds, refused evacuation and continued to command the defense, his calm voice on the radio providing an anchor of stability in the chaos. These were ordinary American servicemen, far from home, fighting for their lives and for each other in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. What they would do in the hours ahead would earn the admiration of a nation and change how America fought its wars. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky on June 10th, the situation at Dong Xoai remained catastrophic. The district headquarters building was still standing, but it was an island surrounded by a sea of enemy soldiers. Throughout the long night, the defenders had beaten back multiple assaults, each one seemingly more determined than the last. The Viet Cong had employed every weapon in their arsenal against the building: machine gun fire that chewed away at the walls, recoilless rifle rounds that exploded with bone-jarring force, and the terrifying whoosh of flamethrowers that sent liquid fire streaming through windows and doorways. Inside the building, the scene was one of controlled desperation. Wounded men lay wherever there was space, some barely conscious, others gritting their teeth against pain that no amount of morphine could fully suppress. Captain Stokes, his legs torn apart by shrapnel, remained conscious and tried to provide guidance despite his injuries. Lieutenant Williams moved through the building constantly, checking on defensive positions, redistributing ammunition, encouraging men who were running on nothing but courage and adrenaline. The Seabees had fully embraced the fighting part of their motto, manning weapons alongside the Green Berets and South Vietnamese troops with a skill that belied their construction training. Outside, the Viet Cong were regrouping for what appeared to be a final assault. Enemy commanders knew that American air power would become increasingly effective once full daylight arrived, and they were determined to overwhelm the defenders before that advantage could be fully leveraged. Through binoculars and the limited visibility of early morning, the Americans could see large formations of enemy soldiers massing for what would clearly be an all-out human wave attack. If that assault succeeded in breaching the building's defenses, there would be no escape, no surrender, only death. Several of the wounded Americans had already pulled the pins on grenades, holding them ready as a final option should the enemy break through. It was in this moment of maximum peril that Lieutenant Williams and Marvin Shields volunteered for a mission that seemed like certain suicide. Enemy machine gun positions, particularly a .30 caliber machine gun emplacement approximately 150 meters from the building, were cutting down anyone who showed themselves outside the structure. This gun was positioned perfectly to cover the open ground surrounding the headquarters, making any movement during daylight impossible. Williams and Shields understood that unless this position was destroyed, there was no hope of holding out until rescue arrived. They were going to have to leave the relative safety of the building, cross open ground under fire, and eliminate that machine gun nest. The two men prepared themselves with a methodical focus of soldiers who understood they were probably about to die. Williams, already wounded 5 times, checked his rifle and gathered grenades. Shields, the guitar-playing Seabee from Washington State, did the same. They waited for a lull in the enemy fire, then burst through the doorway and sprinted toward the enemy position. Viet Cong soldiers immediately opened fire from multiple directions, bullets kicking up dirt all around the two Americans as they zigzagged across the killing ground. They were moving on pure courage and determination, driven by the knowledge that their comrades' survival depended on eliminating that machine gun. The defenders in the headquarters building provided covering fire, their weapons hammering away at enemy positions in a desperate effort to suppress fire and give Williams and Shields a fighting chance. Air Force planes overhead dove in for strafing runs, their cannons tearing into Viet Cong concentrations. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of explosions, gunfire, and aircraft engines that drowned out all thought except the need to keep moving, keep fighting, keep living for just one more second. Williams carried an M72 Law rocket launcher, a then-new weapon that gave infantry soldiers the ability to engage hard targets with considerable punch. As he and Shields closed on the machine gun position, Williams dropped to one knee, shouldered the weapon, and fired. The rocket streaked through the air and impacted the enemy position nearly 150 meters away. The explosion silenced the machine gun momentarily, but secondary positions continued firing. Williams fired a second rocket, then a third. The combined effect of the three warheads completely obliterated the machine gun emplacement, killing the crew and destroying the weapon. It was a remarkable display of accurate fire under extreme stress, the kind of shooting that won battles and saved lives. Williams and Shields immediately began falling back toward the headquarters building, their mission accomplished against all odds. But then, a second enemy machine gun, one that had remained silent during the assault, opened fire. The first burst caught both Americans. Williams was hit in the right arm and right leg, bullets tearing through muscle and shattering bone. Marvin Shields took 2 rounds in his right leg, catastrophic wounds that shattered the bones and severed major blood vessels. Both men went down hard, sprawling in the dirt as enemy fire continued to crack overhead. Williams, despite his newest wounds, managed to reach Shields and began dragging him toward cover. The lieutenant was now wounded 7 times, his body a tapestry of injuries that should have rendered him unconscious from shock and blood loss. But he refused to leave Shields behind, pulling the gravely wounded Seabee across the ground, even as bullets impacted all around them. Other defenders rushed out from the headquarters building, braving the enemy fire to help drag Williams and Shields back to safety. Medics immediately went to work on both men, but Shields' wounds were catastrophic. The bullets had caused massive damage to his right leg, and he was losing blood at an alarming rate. Despite the severity of his injuries, Shields remained conscious and, remarkably, maintained his sense of humor. Hospital corpsman, GIS Second Class, James Keenan, worked frantically to stabilize him, and later recalled that Shields was joking and cutting up to the end, maintaining the positive spirit that had defined him throughout his time at Dong Xoai. But everyone who looked at his wounds understood that unless Shields received advanced medical care very soon, he was going to die. The destruction of the machine gun nest had bought the defenders crucial time, but it had not fundamentally changed their desperate situation. They were still surrounded, still running low on ammunition, still waiting for a rescue that might never come. The Viet Cong continued to mass for another assault, and the building's defenders were exhausted, wounded, and down to their last reserves of strength. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating a scene of devastation. The camp that the Green Berets and Seabees had worked so hard to build was a smoking ruin. Bodies lay scattered across the compound, American, South Vietnamese, Montagnard, and Viet Cong, dead intermingled in the arbitrary democracy of violent death. At 118th Aviation Company headquarters in Bien Hoa, radio operators were receiving increasingly desperate messages from Dong Xoai. Staff Sergeant Harold Crow, one of the Special Forces radio operators, who had managed to keep communications alive through the battle, transmitted what everyone feared would be his last message. His words were stark and terrifying. "I'm using my last battery for the radio, and there is no more ammunition. We are all wounded. Some of the more serious are holding grenades with the safety pins already pulled. The VC are attacking in human waves. The last wave has been defeated, but we are expecting the next wave now." The message was heard in the aviation company's operations center, and every man present understood what it meant. Without immediate intervention, every American at Dong Xoai was going to die. Major Harvey Stewart, the 118th Aviation Company's commanding officer, listened to that message and made a decision that defined his character and the spirit of Army aviation in Vietnam. He stood up, looked at his staff, and said 3 words that would become legendary. "I'm going in." It was a statement of absolute commitment, a refusal to abandon American soldiers no matter the cost. Stewart began organizing a rescue mission that everyone understood was likely to be a one-way trip. He called for volunteers among his pilots and crew chiefs, and every man in the room stepped forward. 3 UH-1B Huey helicopters would make the attempt, along with gunship escorts to provide covering fire. They would fly into a landing zone that was completely surrounded by enemy forces, land under fire, load whoever they could save, and attempt to escape before being shot down. The odds of success were minimal. The odds of survival were even worse. And yet, not a single man hesitated. While Major Stewart and his pilots prepared for their desperate rescue mission, another tragedy was unfolding in the skies above and around Dong Xoai. Throughout the early morning hours, multiple attempts had been made to insert South Vietnamese reinforcements into the battle, and each attempt had ended in catastrophe. The Viet Cong's 273rd Regiment had positioned itself along every likely landing zone and approach route, creating interlocking kill zones that turned helicopter insertions into death traps. The ambushes were executed with a level of tactical sophistication that shocked even experienced American advisors. These weren't guerrillas fighting from the shadows. These were well-trained soldiers implementing a coordinated defensive plan that anticipated every move their enemies would make. The first major reinforcement attempt came at dawn when elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th ARVN Infantry Regiment, were loaded onto helicopters at Puoc Vinh and flown toward Dong Xoai. The landing zone selected was approximately 4 kilometers north of the camp, near the Thuan Loy rubber plantation. As the helicopters descended toward the LZ, the pilots and crew chiefs saw what appeared to be civilians on the ground, some waving in what seemed like a friendly greeting. The American door gunners held their fire, unwilling to shoot what might be innocent villagers. The helicopters landed, and South Vietnamese soldiers jumped from the cargo bays and began moving out to secure the area. Then, the civilians dropped into prepared fighting positions that had been camouflaged so expertly that they were invisible from the air. Heavy machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions, creating a crossfire that caught the ARVN soldiers in the open with no cover. It was a slaughter. Men were cut down before they could raise their weapons or take cover. Within minutes, the entire landing force was dead, dying or scattered in the jungle, trying desperately to escape. The helicopters that had inserted them came under fire as well, pilots struggling to get their aircraft airborne, while bullets punched through thin aluminum skin and shattered plexiglass windscreens. Most of the helicopters escaped with damage, but the ARVN battalion they had brought was effectively destroyed within 20 minutes of landing. The helicopter crews returned to base in shock, reporting the disaster to their commanders. But the need to reinforce Dong Xoai was so critical that another insertion was ordered almost immediately, this time at a different location, the grass airstrip at Thuan Loy plantation itself. Surely, commanders reasoned, the Viet Cong couldn't have ambush positions prepared at every possible landing site. But they were wrong. The VC commanders had anticipated this exact thinking and had positioned troops to cover the airstrip as well. As the second wave of helicopters approached with elements of the ARVN 43rd Regiment, enemy gunners waited with disciplined patience. The helicopters landed, and once again, South Vietnamese soldiers disembarked into what became a killing field. But this time, the ambush included even heavier weapons. A mortar team that had pre-ranged the airstrip began dropping shells onto the landing zone with terrifying accuracy. One of the helicopters, designated Bluetail 1 from the 118th Aviation Company's 2nd Flight Platoon, had just dropped its troops and was lifting off when a mortar round struck it directly. The Huey rolled over in midair and exploded, a ball of flame and debris that plummeted to the ground. Killed instantly were the 4 crew members and 2 U.S. Army advisors who had been riding along to coordinate with the ARVN troops. Another advisor who had just disembarked from the helicopter managed to get on the radio and began screaming warnings to other approaching aircraft, trying desperately to stop them from landing in the same death trap. Then his transmission cut off abruptly, and he was never heard from again. Chief Warrant Officer Ralph Orlando, the bandit pilot who had been providing fire support throughout the battle, later wrote in his diary that, of the more than 500 ARVN troops inserted at the 2 landing zones, approximately 250 were unaccounted for, a cold military term that meant they were dead, captured, or lost in the jungle. The scale of the disaster was almost incomprehensible. In the span of just a few hours, the Viet Cong had effectively destroyed 2 ARVN battalions and killed multiple American helicopter crew members and advisors. The ambushes had been so perfectly executed, so devastatingly effective, that senior commanders made the difficult decision to suspend further helicopter insertions. The Dong Xoai landing zones had become kill zones, and sending more men there would simply feed more lives into the meat grinder. But even as the helicopter insertions were being suspended, other South Vietnamese units were fighting their way toward Dong Xoai by land. The ARVN 52nd Ranger Battalion, an elite unit with a reputation for aggressive combat effectiveness, was ordered to conduct a ground assault to retake the camp and relieve the besieged defenders. These Rangers were arguably the best troops the South Vietnamese military could field, well-trained, well-led, and experienced in the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that characterized the Vietnam War. They moved out from their base and began advancing toward Dong Xoai, knowing they were walking into a battle that had already consumed hundreds of lives. The Rangers ran straight into another carefully prepared ambush. Viet Cong soldiers had established defensive positions along the approach routes, and they opened fire as soon as the Rangers came into range. But unlike the helicopter-borne troops who had been slaughtered in the landing zones, the Rangers were prepared for a fight. They returned fire immediately, their weapons hammering away at enemy positions as they maneuvered for advantage. What followed was a savage yard-by-yard battle through jungle and rubber plantation, with neither side willing to give ground. The Rangers took casualties, serious casualties, but they pushed forward with relentless determination. By the afternoon of June 10th, the Rangers had fought their way into the outskirts of Dong Xoai town and were beginning to recapture parts of the devastated Special Forces camp. It was costly progress, paid for in blood, but it was progress nonetheless. The Rangers found scenes of horror as they advanced. Bodies of civilians who had been caught in the crossfire, destroyed buildings still smoldering from the battle, and equipment scattered everywhere. But they also found survivors, small groups of Montagnard fighters and South Vietnamese troops who had held out through the night and were now in desperate need of help. The Rangers' arrival didn't end the battle, but it shifted the momentum for the first time since the Viet Cong assault had begun. The next day, June 11th, brought another major reinforcement effort when the ARVN 7th Airborne Battalion was inserted near the Thuan Loy area to search for survivors from the earlier helicopter assaults and to expand the relief operation. The Viet Cong had withdrawn many of their forces by this point, recognizing that continued engagement with American air power operating in daylight would result in unsustainable casualties. But they had left behind enough troops to execute one final ambush. The ARVN paratroopers, despite being among the best-trained troops in the South Vietnamese military, walked into yet another prepared killing zone. The resulting battle decimated the battalion. By the following morning, only 159 of the 479 paratroopers who had landed at Dong Xoai remained combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. It was Rangers from the 52nd Battalion who eventually found and rescued LTJG Frank Peterlin and EOC Johnny McCulley, the two Seabees who had been fighting on the northeast berm of the camp when their position was overrun. These two men had been through an ordeal that few could imagine surviving. Peterlin had fought until his ammunition was exhausted, then escaped through the wire and took refuge in the jungle. He spent the next day evading enemy patrols, moving silently through terrain he barely knew, using every bit of training and instinct to avoid capture. McCulley had a similar experience, wounded by shrapnel and a machine gun bullet, but refusing to quit. Accompanied by two Vietnamese soldiers, he made it to a small sawmill near the village and hid there through June 10th, listening to the sounds of battle and wondering if rescue would ever come. On the morning of June 11th, when the Viet Cong finally withdrew and Rangers secured the area, both Seabees were found alive and evacuated to safety. The casualty figures from these relief operations were staggering and provided a sobering illustration of how deadly the battle for Dong Xoai had become. 8 U.S. helicopter crewmen were dead, including the crew of Blue Tail 1. 5 U.S. Army advisors had been killed, trying to coordinate with ARVN forces. Approximately 400 South Vietnamese soldiers from various units had been killed or were missing. The Viet Cong had achieved exactly what they had planned. They had inflicted catastrophic casualties, not just on the camp's defenders, but on every unit that attempted to intervene. The battle was demonstrating, in the most brutal way possible, that American helicopters were vulnerable, that South Vietnamese troops could be defeated in detail, and that the Viet Cong possessed both the tactical skill and the firepower to conduct major conventional operations. Yet even amid this catalog of disasters, acts of extraordinary courage continued to emerge. American helicopter pilots kept flying into danger zones to evacuate wounded, knowing that each approach could be their last. South Vietnamese Rangers fought with a determination that earned the respect of every American who witnessed it. Montagnard fighters, whose loyalty to the Special Forces advisors who had trained them was unshakable, held their positions long after any reasonable person would have fled. And in the district headquarters building at the heart of Dong Xoai, a group of Americans waited for rescue, determined to hold out for one more hour, one more minute, one more second, refusing to surrender or quit no matter what the cost. At approximately 1 p.m. on June 10th, Major Harvey Stewart lifted off from Bien Hoa in the lead helicopter of a 3-ship formation that was about to attempt the impossible. Behind him flew 5 other pilots and their crew chiefs, volunteers who had accepted the near certainty of death in order to save their fellow Americans trapped at Dong Xoai. The gunship escorts flanked the formation, their pilots knowing they would have to suppress an entire regiment's worth of firepower to give the rescue birds any chance of getting in and out alive. As the helicopters flew north over the jungle, every man aboard understood that what they were attempting had less than a 50% chance of success. But not one of them had hesitated when Stewart called for volunteers. The flight to Dong Xoai took about 30 minutes, and as the helicopters approached the area, the pilots could see smoke rising from multiple fires. The camp below looked like it had been hit by an artillery barrage. Buildings were destroyed or damaged, vehicles were burning, and the ground was cratered from mortar impacts. Enemy soldiers were visible moving through the ruins, though in smaller numbers now that daylight had arrived and American air power was operating continuously overhead. Air Force forward air controllers had designated the entire Dong Xoai camp area as a free strike zone, meaning that any aircraft overhead had authorization to engage targets without prior approval. Fighter bombers were making runs across the area, dropping napalm and high explosive bombs in a deliberate effort to suppress enemy fire before the rescue helicopters arrived. The defenders in the district headquarters building had been informed that helicopters were coming. Lieutenant Williams, now barely able to stand due to his 7 wounds and massive blood loss, organized the evacuation. The wounded were gathered near exits, ready to be carried or helped to the landing zone. Men who could still fight were positioned to provide covering fire during the critical minutes when the helicopters would be most vulnerable. Captain Stokes, his legs destroyed but his mind still sharp, gave advice and encouragement from where he lay. Everyone understood that this was their only chance. If these helicopters were driven off or destroyed, there would be no second attempt. This was survive or die. Major Stewart brought his formation in fast and low, the helicopters racing over the treetops as gunships blazed away at enemy positions. Viet Cong soldiers opened fire from multiple locations, their weapons reaching up toward the American aircraft like streams of deadly light. Tracers arced through the air in both directions, creating a lethal light show that was hypnotically beautiful and utterly terrifying. The gunships fired rockets at identified machine gun positions, their warheads exploding in orange balls of flame and black smoke. Door gunners on all the helicopters held down their triggers, their M60 machine guns hammering away at anything that moved below. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, the roar of multiple helicopter engines combined with the continuous staccato of machine gun fire and the whoosh and explosion of rockets. The 3 rescue helicopters flared hard and landed in a small clearing near the district headquarters building. Before the skids even touched the ground, crew chiefs and door gunners were leaping out to help load casualties. The defenders came running from the building, carrying wounded comrades, dragging equipment, moving with the desperate speed of men who knew every second counted. Viet Cong fire intensified, bullets snapping through the air and impacting all around the helicopters. The American door gunners returned fire continuously, their weapons getting so hot they were nearly smoking, brass shell casings cascading to the ground in a metallic rain. Pilots kept their engines at full power, ready to lift off at an instant's notice if the situation became untenable. Marvin Shields was carried to one of the helicopters by his fellow Seabees, hospital corpsman, second-class James Keenan, staying with him. Despite his catastrophic wounds, despite the fact that he had lost massive amounts of blood and should have been unconscious or dead, Shields was still talking, still joking with the men around him, It was a display of courage so profound that everyone who witnessed it would remember it for the rest of their lives. Keenan worked frantically to stabilize him during the loading process, knowing that the young Seabee's life was slipping away but refusing to give up. As Shields was lifted into the helicopter, he thanked everyone who helped him, his voice weak but his spirit unbroken. Lieutenant Williams supervised the evacuation. With the same calm professionalism he had displayed throughout the battle, he ensured that the most seriously wounded went first, that everyone who could be saved was accounted for, that no one was left behind. Only when every other American and as many South Vietnamese and Montagnard fighters as could be loaded were aboard the helicopters did Williams allow himself to be helped toward one of the aircraft. He was the last American out, fulfilling the ancient military tradition that the commander is the last to leave the field. As he was lifted into the helicopter, enemy fire was still snapping all around, bullets punching holes in the thin aluminum skin of the Huey's fuselage and tail boom. Major Stewart's helicopter was the first to lift off, its turbine screaming as the pilot pulled maximum power and clawed for altitude. The other two helicopters followed seconds later, all three aircraft climbing rapidly while taking fire from multiple directions. One of the crew chiefs was hit, a bullet grazing his arm and drawing blood but not incapacitating him. Another helicopter took hits in the engine compartment that damaged non-critical systems but didn't bring the aircraft down. The gunships made one final pass, expending the last of their rockets and ammunition to cover the rescue birds' escape, then broke off and formed up for the flight. Back to base. Against all odds, all three rescue helicopters made it out. Major Stewart's courage and leadership in executing this mission would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest award for valor. Inside the helicopters during the flight back to medical facilities, the full horror of the battle became apparent. The aircraft were packed with wounded men, blood covering the floors and seats, the smell of cordite and sweat and blood filling the cargo compartments. Medics and crew chiefs worked desperately to keep the most seriously wounded alive, applying pressure to bleeding wounds, starting IVs, administering morphine. Some of the wounded were conscious and in terrible pain, others were unconscious or in shock. The helicopters flew as fast as their engines would allow, every mile bringing the wounded closer to the advanced medical care they so desperately needed. Marvin Shields held on for as long as he could. Keenan stayed with him throughout the flight, talking to him, encouraging him, doing everything medically possible to keep him alive. Shields remained conscious for much of the flight, maintaining the positive attitude that had defined him. He was joking and cutting up to the end, Keenan would later recall. When he finally went under, it was very quiet, nothing dramatic. He just went to sleep. Those were the words that described the death of the first and only Seabee to receive the Medal of Honor in any American war. Marvin Shields had come to Dong Xoai to build things, to improve the camp and help American forces establish a presence in hostile territory. Instead, he had proven the second half of his service's motto, "We build, we fight." And he had fought with a courage that would never be forgotten. The helicopters landed at medical facilities, and teams of doctors and nurses rushed to treat the wounded. Lieutenant Charles Williams, despite his 7 wounds, had remained conscious throughout the evacuation flight. He was immediately taken into surgery, where doctors worked to repair the damage that shrapnel and bullets had inflicted on his body. The young officer would survive his wounds, though recovery would be long and painful. More importantly, he would survive to receive recognition for valor that few American servicemen had ever achieved. His actions at Dong Xoai, his refusal to quit despite being wounded multiple times, his leadership in the darkest hours, and his assault on the enemy machine gun position with Marvin Shields had earned him a nomination for the Medal of Honor. As the wounded were being treated and the rescue helicopters were refueled and rearmed, the battle for Dong Xoai was entering its final phase. The ARVN Rangers had fought their way into the camp and were systematically clearing the area of remaining Viet Cong soldiers. American air power continued to pound enemy positions, with fighter bombers making run after run, their bombs and napalm transforming large sections of the battlefield into moonscapes of craters and ash. The Viet Cong, having achieved much of their objective in terms of inflicting casualties and demonstrating their capabilities, were beginning to withdraw. They melted back into the jungle, carrying their wounded and as much equipment as they could salvage, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would shock even experienced combat veterans. By the afternoon of June 11th, Dong Xoai was back in Allied hands, though calling it a victory would have been grotesque mischaracterization. The camp was destroyed, the town was in ruins, hundreds were dead, and the wounded numbered in the hundreds more. The battle had demonstrated, with brutal clarity, that the Vietnam War was entering a new and more dangerous phase. This hadn't been a guerrilla ambush or a small-scale raid. This had been a coordinated multi-regiment assault conducted with a level of tactical sophistication and firepower that shocked American planners. The Viet Cong had proven they could mass forces, execute complex operations, and inflict catastrophic casualties on both American and South Vietnamese forces. The implications of the battle were being discussed at the highest levels of American military and political leadership. General William Westmoreland, commanding U.S. forces in Vietnam, recognized that Dong Xoai represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the conflict. The advisory mission, with small groups of Americans training and supporting South Vietnamese forces, was no longer adequate to meet the threat. The United States was going to have to commit major ground combat forces to Vietnam, or risk watching the South Vietnamese military be defeated in detail by an enemy that was growing stronger and more capable with each passing month. The Battle of Dong Xoai, in other words, was one of the key turning points that led to America's full-scale military involvement in Vietnam. But for the men who had fought at Dong Xoai, the strategic implications were less important than the immediate reality. They had survived. Against overwhelming odds, facing an enemy that should have wiped them out completely, they had held on long enough for rescue to arrive. They had lost friends, had seen horrors that would haunt them forever, and had been pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. But they had survived. In the days and weeks ahead, as their wounds healed and they processed what they had experienced, they would come to understand that they had been part of something extraordinary. They had fought one of the most intense small unit actions in the early years of the Vietnam War, and they had proven that American soldiers, when tested to the breaking point, would not break. In the days following the rescue of the Americans from the district headquarters building, the true scale of the Battle of Dong Xoai began to emerge. The numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. 3 U.S. Special Forces soldiers were dead. 2 Navy Seabees, including Marvin Shields, had been killed. 8 U.S. helicopter crewmen had died in the attempts to reinforce the camp, their aircraft shot down or destroyed on the ground. 5 U.S. Army advisors had been killed while trying to coordinate South Vietnamese troops during the relief operations. Among the 15 surviving Americans who had been inside the camp during the battle, all but 1 had been wounded, some multiple times. It was a casualty rate of over 90%, a testament to the intensity and brutality of the fighting. The South Vietnamese and Montagnard losses were even more devastating. Inside the camp itself, approximately 43 Montagnard CIDG fighters and South Vietnamese troops had been killed fighting alongside the Americans. Many more had been wounded or were listed as missing. The relief operations had cost the lives of approximately 400 ARVN soldiers from various units, the 1st Battalion 7th Infantry, elements of the 43rd Regiment, and the 7th Airborne Battalion, all suffering catastrophic casualties in the ambushes that had been so carefully prepared by the Viet Cong. When all the numbers were tallied, South Vietnamese military and militia casualties totaled nearly 1,200 men, killed, wounded, or missing. It was one of the worst defeats the ARVN had suffered up to that point in the war. The civilian toll remained largely uncounted, as was tragically common in this conflict. The district capital of Dong Xoai had been home to several hundred civilians, including families of the militia members stationed there. Many of these people had taken shelter as the battle raged, hiding in bunkers, cellars, and anywhere else that might provide protection from the storm of fire sweeping through their town. Despite these efforts, casualties among the civilian population were severe. Later estimates suggested that approximately 300 civilians had been killed during the battle, caught between the warring forces with no safe place to go. An additional 2,500 people were displaced, rendered homeless by the destruction of their town. They would become refugees, joining the millions of Vietnamese whose lives were torn apart by this war. The Viet Cong had paid a heavy price as well. though exact numbers remained uncertain, as they always did, when counting enemy casualties. American estimates placed Viet Cong dead at between 500 and 700 soldiers, losses inflicted primarily by American air power and the determined defense of the camp. These casualty figures represented perhaps a third of the attacking force, a significant percentage but not enough to prevent the Viet Cong from achieving many of their objectives. They had demonstrated their ability to conduct large-scale coordinated attacks. They had inflicted severe casualties on both American and South Vietnamese forces, and they had proven that Special Forces camps were vulnerable to determined assault. From a purely military perspective, the Viet Cong could claim the Battle of Dong Xoai as a strategic success, even if the tactical outcome had been a draw. One of the most haunting aspects of the battle's aftermath was the discovery of what had happened to the ARVN soldiers who had been inserted at the landing zones near Thuan Loy. Search teams found evidence of hasty mass graves, indicating that at least some of the South Vietnamese troops had been captured and executed. Others had clearly died fighting, their bodies found in positions that suggested they had attempted to rally and resist even after being ambushed. Still others had fled into the jungle and were never found, their fate unknown. The soldiers who had been massacred at those landing zones had walked into traps that were so well prepared, so perfectly executed, that they had almost no chance of survival. It was a sobering lesson about the capabilities of the enemy American forces were facing. In the hospitals where the American survivors were being treated, the physical and psychological toll of the battle became increasingly apparent. Lieutenant Charles Williams underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage from his 7 wounds. Doctors worked to reconstruct shattered bones, repair torn muscles, and ensure that no infections would set in to complicate his recovery. Williams was fortunate that none of his wounds had struck vital organs, but the cumulative effect of being hit 7 times left him with a long and difficult rehabilitation ahead. Despite his injuries, Williams's primary concern was for the men who had served under him. He asked repeatedly about casualties, about who had made it out and who hadn't, displaying the same leadership and concern for his troops that had defined his actions during the battle. The other American survivors faced similar challenges. Some had relatively minor wounds that would heal with time. Others faced permanent disabilities, injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. All of them carried psychological wounds that were less visible but no less real. They had experienced combat at its most intense, had seen friends die, had come within seconds of death themselves. Processing that trauma would take years, if it could be processed at all. Many would wake from nightmares for decades afterward, reliving the moments when mortars fell, when machine guns opened fire, when the world became nothing but fire and death, and the desperate need to survive for one more second. LTJG Frank Peterlin and EOC Johnny McCulley, the 2 Seabees who had escaped from the camp and hidden in the jungle before being rescued by rangers, had their own harrowing story. Both men had fought with distinction, manning machine guns and recoilless rifles on the northeast berm of the camp until their position was overrun. They had then made the difficult decision to escape rather than be killed or captured, threading their way through enemy lines and evading Viet Cong patrols for hours. Peterlin had been wounded by shrapnel during the fighting, while McCulley had been hit by both shrapnel and a machine gun bullet. That they survived their wounds, their escape, and their time hiding from enemy forces was remarkable. That they maintained the discipline and presence of mind to stay hidden until friendly forces secured the area demonstrated the quality of training and the strength of character that defined the Seabees. As news of the battle spread throughout the American military community in Vietnam, it sent shockwaves through every unit. If Dong Xoai could be overrun, if a camp defended by Green Berets and fortified by Seabees could be reduced to rubble in a single night's fighting, then nowhere was truly safe. Special Forces camps throughout South Vietnam went on heightened alert. Defensive positions were improved, contingency plans for evacuations were developed and rehearsed. Intelligence officers worked overtime trying to identify where the next attack might come. The Battle of Dong Xoai had fundamentally changed how Americans viewed the security situation in Vietnam. The advisory mission, conducted with small teams and limited firepower, was proving inadequate to deal with an enemy that could field regiment-sized forces and attack with conventional military tactics. At higher headquarters, the implications were being debated with increasing urgency. General William Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, had been arguing for months that significant American ground combat forces would be needed to prevent South Vietnamese defeat. Dong Xoai provided powerful evidence in support of his position. President Lyndon Johnson and his advisors in Washington were being forced to confront a reality they had hoped to avoid. America was either going to have to dramatically escalate its military commitment to Vietnam, or accept the possibility that South Vietnam would fall to communist forces. The battle that had raged at a remote jungle outpost was influencing decisions being made at the highest levels of American government. Among the units that had fought at Dong Xoai, there was a mixture of grief and pride. The 118th Aviation Company, whose pilots and crew chiefs had flown into hell multiple times to support the camp's defenders, mourned their dead but took pride in their accomplishments. They had lost aircraft and crew members, but they had also saved lives and demonstrated the courage that would define Army aviation throughout the war. The company's motto, "It shall be done," had been proven in blood and fire. When commanders needed helicopters to fly into the most dangerous situations, when missions seemed impossible, the 118th had stepped forward and completed the task. Dong Xoai would become part of the unit's proud history, a battle that exemplified everything they stood for. The Special Forces community mourned the loss of their 3 men, but recognized that detachment, A342, had fought with extraordinary valor. The fact that any Americans had survived the battle was a testament to the training, courage, and leadership that defined the Green Berets. Second Lieutenant Williams' actions would be studied at Special Forces schools for years to come. His decision-making under impossible conditions serving as a model for future officers. The Montagnard CIDG fighters, who had stood their ground and fought alongside the Americans, had proven the effectiveness of the Special Forces model of training and leading indigenous forces. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, they had inflicted significant casualties on the enemy and had refused to collapse even under the most intense pressure. The Navy Seabee community was devastated by the loss of Marvin Shields and the other Seabee killed at Dong Xoai, but they also recognized that their men had lived up to the service's proud motto, "We build, we fight." The Seabees had gone to Dong Xoai to construct fortifications and improve the camp's defensive capabilities. When the battle began, they had fought with the same skill and courage as combat infantry soldiers. Shields' actions in particular, his assault on the enemy machine gun position alongside Lieutenant Williams, had been the act of a warrior, not a construction worker. The fact that he had maintained his sense of humor and positive spirit, even while dying from catastrophic wounds, spoke to the character of the man and the service he represented. As the wounded began their long journey toward recovery, the military bureaucracy began processing the paperwork that would recognize the extraordinary valor displayed at Dong Xoai. Witness statements were collected from survivors. After-action reports were written by commanders at every level. Recommendations for medals were prepared and reviewed. The process was thorough and methodical, ensuring that acts of courage would be appropriately recognized and that the lessons of the battle would be documented for future study. 2 names kept appearing at the top of every list. 2 men whose actions had transcended ordinary courage and entered the realm of the truly extraordinary. Second Lieutenant Charles Q. Williams and construction mechanic, 3rd Class Marvin Glenn Shields. In the weeks following the battle, operations around Dong Xoai continued as American and South Vietnamese forces worked to secure the area and prevent the Viet Cong from returning. The 118th Aviation Company found itself heavily engaged in these follow-up operations, conducting reconnaissance flights, inserting small patrols, and evacuating casualties when contact with the enemy occurred. The intensity of these operations, combined with the recent losses at Dong Xoai, placed tremendous strain on the unit's personnel and equipment. Pilots and crew chiefs were flying multiple missions per day. Maintenance crews were working around the clock to keep helicopters airworthy, and everyone was operating on minimal sleep and maximum stress. On June 20th, 1965, 11 days after the initial battle, the 118th Aviation Company conducted what would be one of the final major operations connected to Dong Xoai. Intelligence reports indicated that small groups of Viet Cong soldiers might still be in the area, and a mission was planned to insert reconnaissance teams and provide helicopter fire support if enemy forces were located. 3 Thunderbird helicopters, led by Major Stewart himself, roared into the area in the early afternoon. The landing zone was outside the Special Forces compound, in an area that had been swept by ARVN Rangers but might still harbor enemy soldiers. The helicopters descended toward the LZ, with all the caution that weeks of hard experience had taught. Door gunners scanned the tree line, their fingers on triggers, ready to engage at the first sign of hostile fire. The pilots kept their aircraft moving, never presenting a stationary target, always ready to break off and climb for altitude if an ambush was sprung. When the helicopters touched down, the reconnaissance teams leapt out and moved quickly to secure the immediate area. There was no enemy fire, no ambush, just the eerie quiet of a battlefield where the fighting had moved on, but the scars remained. The mission proceeded without incident, and by late afternoon, all survivors from the camp who had been in hiding or evading enemy forces had been located and evacuated. The Battle of Dong Xoai was finally, truly over. The day of heavy fighting on June 10th had cost the 118th Aviation Company dearly. They had lost 1 complete helicopter crew and aircraft when Bluetail 1 was struck by that mortar round and exploded. Nearly every helicopter that had flown that day had sustained battle damage, with bullet holes in fuselages, damaged rotor blades, and shattered instruments. 10 Purple Hearts were awarded to members of the 118th for wounds sustained during the Dong Xoai operations. Major Stewart received the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the dramatic rescue mission. Multiple other pilots and crew members received Silver Stars, Distinguished Flying Crosses, and Bronze Stars for valor. The unit's performance at Dong Xoai would become the standard by which all subsequent operations were measured. The battle had thrust the 118th Aviation Company into the spotlight of Army aviation history. Their actions over those desperate days had demonstrated what helicopter crews were capable of when pushed to the limit. They had flown into landing zones that should have been death traps. They had provided fire support for ground forces under impossible conditions. They had evacuated wounded under fire, maintained aircraft under combat conditions, and completed every mission assigned to them regardless of the cost. The phrase that defined the unit, "It shall be done," had been proven repeatedly at Dong Xoai. Other helicopter units throughout Vietnam looked to the 118th as an example of what dedication and courage could accomplish. For the ARVN Rangers who had fought their way into Dong Xoai and helped secure the camp, the battle was both a triumph and a tragedy. They had demonstrated that South Vietnamese forces could fight effectively even when facing overwhelming odds. They had taken heavy casualties but had not broken, had not retreated, had continued pushing forward until the objective was secured. The 52nd Ranger Battalion in particular had earned the respect of every American who had witnessed their performance. These were soldiers who fought with a skill and determination that rivaled any American unit. The fact that they had been able to fight through a prepared ambush and recapture portions of the camp was a testament to their training, leadership, and courage. Yet the Rangers' success could not erase the broader failure of the relief operations. The massacres at the landing zones, the destruction of 2 ARVN battalions in a matter of hours, the loss of hundreds of soldiers to perfectly executed ambushes, all of this pointed to serious problems with how operations were being conducted. The Viet Cong had demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication and battlefield intelligence that shocked American planners. They had known exactly where relief forces would land, had prepared ambush positions covering multiple landing zones, and had executed their plan with disciplined precision. This wasn't lucky guerrilla warfare. This was professional soldiering conducted by an enemy that was learning and adapting faster than many American commanders had believed possible. The lessons of Dong Xoai were being studied intensively by military professionals at every level. Intelligence officers tried to understand how the Viet Cong had been able to mass 2 regiments without being detected until it was too late. Operations officers examined the decisions that had led to inserting troops into what became kill zones. Aviation commanders looked at helicopter tactics and how to better support ground forces in high-threat environments. Logistics officers calculated what it would take to supply and sustain larger American ground combat units that were clearly going to be needed. The battle had created a wealth of hard-won knowledge, purchased with blood, but potentially valuable in preventing future disasters. One of the most significant lessons concerned the use of helicopters in contested landing zones. The assumption that American air mobility would allow forces to rapidly insert troops anywhere they were needed had been brutally tested at Dong Xoai. The Viet Cong had proven they could prepare positions covering likely landing zones and could mass sufficient firepower to destroy helicopter-borne troops before they could organize a defense. Future operations would require more careful reconnaissance, better suppression of enemy positions before insertions, and contingency plans for when landing zones proved too hot to use. The concept of air mobility remained sound, but the tactics for implementing it would have to evolve based on what had been learned at places like Dong Xoai. The battle also demonstrated the critical importance of air power in preventing tactical defeats from becoming catastrophes. The Air Force fighter bombers and Army helicopter gunships that had provided continuous fire support throughout the battle had prevented the Viet Cong from completely overrunning the defenders. The napalm, bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire from aircraft had killed large numbers of enemy soldiers and had broken up attack formations at critical moments. Without that air support, it is almost certain that every American at Dong Xoai would have been killed. The lesson was clear. American air superiority was the decisive advantage that could offset enemy advantages in numbers and tactical positioning. Future operations would need to ensure that ground forces always had access to responsive air support. For the South Vietnamese military and government, Dong Xoai was another in a series of events that demonstrated their vulnerability to large-scale communist attacks. The political instability that had followed General Khan's ouster in February had not been resolved, and the military was struggling to maintain cohesion while dealing with enemy forces that seemed to be growing stronger. The heavy casualties suffered in the relief operations raised serious questions about ARVN readiness and capabilities. While units like the Rangers had fought well, other formations had been destroyed with shocking ease. The South Vietnamese military was going to need more training, better equipment, improved leadership, and above all, more time to develop into a force that could stand on its own against the Viet Cong and increasingly against North Vietnamese regular army units. In Hanoi, North Vietnamese leaders viewed the Battle of Dong Xoai as validation of their summer offensive strategy. They had sought to inflict significant losses on South Vietnamese forces, and to demonstrate that American advisory efforts were insufficient to prevent communist victories. By both measures, Dong Xoai had been a success. The fact that American ground combat troops had not been present in significant numbers at the battle meant that the defeat could be attributed primarily to ARVN failings. This supported the North Vietnamese narrative that the Saigon government was weak and that only American military power was keeping it alive. The battle strengthened the political argument within North Vietnam for continuing and intensifying military operations in the South. The strategic implications of Dong Xoai extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The battle had demonstrated to American policymakers that a fundamental decision point had been reached. The United States could continue with the advisory mission, accepting that this would likely result in additional defeats like Dong Xoai and possibly the eventual collapse of South Vietnam. Or America could commit major ground combat forces, transforming the conflict from a South Vietnamese war with American support into an American war with South Vietnamese support. This decision would ultimately be made by President Johnson in July 1965, when he authorized the deployment of substantial American ground combat units to Vietnam. While many factors influenced that decision, the Battle of Dong Xoai was among the key events that made the need for escalation undeniable. On a warm day in June 1966, exactly 1 year after the Battle of Dong Xoai, Second Lieutenant Charles Q. Williams stood in the East Room of the White House and listened as President Lyndon Johnson prepared to present him with the Medal of Honor. Williams was in his dress uniform, his bearing erect despite the injuries that still caused him pain. His body had healed from the 7 wounds he sustained during that terrible night, but the memories remained as fresh as the day they were formed. As President Johnson spoke about Williams's actions, about his courage under fire, about his refusal to quit even when wounded multiple times, Williams thought about the men who hadn't made it home, about Marvin Shields and the other Americans who had died at Dong Xoai. President Johnson's words that day captured something essential about what Williams and his fellow soldiers had accomplished. "We have come here this morning to honor a very brave American soldier," Johnson said. "Lieutenant Williams, it is hard for your president to find words to tell you of the deep gratitude and admiration that your fellow Americans have for what you did. The president then read the citation that detailed Williams's actions, how he had taken command when the camp commander was wounded, how he had organized the defense despite being wounded himself, how he had directed airstrikes that saved the lives of his men, and how he had assaulted an enemy machine gun position even after being wounded 5 times already. The citation was remarkable in its detail and in what it revealed about the intensity of the battle. It described Williams being wounded 7 times over the course of 14 hours, each wound severe enough that most men would have been incapacitated. Yet Williams had continued fighting. It described his leadership in consolidating American personnel into the district headquarters building when the outer perimeter fell. It described his coordination of airstrikes that prevented the Viet Cong from overrunning the defenders' final position. And it described his assault with Marvin Shields on the enemy machine gun nest, an action that had been critical to the survival of everyone in that building, but had resulted in Williams receiving 2 more wounds and Shields receiving the wounds that would kill him. When President Johnson placed the light blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around Williams's neck, the young officer maintained his military bearing, but those who knew him could see the emotion in his eyes. This medal represented not just his own actions, but the courage of every man who had fought at Dong Xoai. It was recognition not only for those who survived, but for those who had died defending that remote outpost. Williams accepted the medal in their name as much as his own, understanding that he was simply the man chosen to represent the collective valor of the defenders. In his brief remarks after receiving the medal, Williams spoke about the team effort, about the Montagnard fighters who had stood their ground, about the helicopter crews who had braved enemy fire to bring support and evacuation. He was gracious and humble, displaying the same character that had made him an effective leader during the battle. 1 month later, in July 1966, President Johnson presided over another Medal of Honor ceremony, this one posthumous. Joan Shields, Marvin's widow, and their young daughter Barbara stood in the White House to accept the medal on behalf of the fallen Seabee. The ceremony was emotionally wrenching for everyone present. Joan Shields had lost her husband, Barbara had lost her father, and the Navy had lost one of its finest. President Johnson spoke about Shields' sacrifice with visible emotion, recognizing that this was the first time a Seabee had received the nation's highest military decoration and understanding the weight of that historic moment. Shields' Medal of Honor citation described his actions in detail that made clear the extraordinary nature of his courage. It noted how he had voluntarily accompanied Lieutenant Williams on the assault against the enemy machine gun position, how he had helped Williams fire the rockets that destroyed that position, and how he had been mortally wounded during the withdrawal, but had never complained or lost his positive spirit. The citation captured something of the man's character, the former lumberjack who had brought his guitar to a war zone and had faced death with jokes and encouragement for the men around him. President Johnson's words to Joan and Barbara Shields were simple but profound. Their husband and father had died in service to his country, and that sacrifice would never be forgotten. The Navy moved quickly to honor Shields' memory in a way that would ensure his name lived on. The first Seabee camp built in Vietnam, located at Chu Lai, was renamed Camp Shields that same year. It was a fitting tribute, as it connected Shields' name to the construction mission that had brought him to Vietnam in the first place. The camp became a major logistics hub and construction base, supporting operations throughout the region. Every Seabee who served at Camp Shields would learn the story of Marvin Shields, would understand that the camp's name represented the highest ideals of their service, the willingness to build in support of the mission and to fight when the mission demanded it. The 2 Medal of Honor recipients from the Battle of Dong Xoai represented different branches of service and came from different backgrounds, but their actions had been united by common threads of courage, selflessness, and devotion to duty. Williams, the former enlisted man who had become an officer and Special Forces soldier, embodied the best traditions of the Army's unconventional warfare mission. Shields, the construction mechanic who had proven himself a warrior when circumstances demanded it, embodied the Seabees' proud history of fighting, when necessary, while remaining primarily builders. Together, their stories illustrated what made the American military effective: the ability of ordinary men to perform extraordinary acts when their country and their fellow soldiers needed them most. Other awards and decorations flowed from the Battle of Dong Xoai as well. LTJG Frank Peterlin and EOC Johnny McCulley Both received Silver Stars for their actions during the battle and their successful evasion of enemy forces afterward. Multiple Green Berets received Bronze Stars with V devices for valor, recognizing their courage under fire. Captain Bill Stokes, who had been wounded early in the battle but had continued to provide advice and leadership despite his injuries, was recognized for his actions. Sergeant First Class James T. Taylor, Jr., the medic who had helped evacuate wounded throughout the battle, received a Bronze Star for his dedication to saving lives under the most difficult conditions imaginable. The entire Seabee Team 1104 received the Navy Unit Commendation, recognition that honored not just the individuals but the team as a collective. This was appropriate as the Seabees had functioned as a cohesive unit throughout the battle, supporting each other and fighting alongside the Green Berets with seamless coordination. The citation for the unit commendation detailed the team's contributions to the camp's defense and acknowledged the heavy price they had paid. 2 killed and 6 wounded out of 9 team members present during the battle. It was a casualty rate that spoke to the intensity of the fighting and to the courage of the men who had endured it. The awards and ceremonies served multiple purposes beyond simply recognizing individual courage. They provided closure for families who had lost loved ones, giving them tangible recognition that their loss had meaning and that their sacrifice had been noted at the highest levels. They served as inspiration for other servicemen, demonstrating that acts of valor would be recognized and honored. They created official records of what had happened at Dong Xoai, ensuring that the battle would be remembered and studied. And they reinforced the military values of courage, duty, and sacrifice that were essential to maintaining an effective fighting force. The medals were symbols, but they were symbols that carried immense weight and meaning for everyone connected to the military profession. For Charles Williams, life after receiving the Medal of Honor was complicated. He remained in the Army for several more years, serving with distinction, but always aware that he was now set apart by the nation's highest decoration. Fellow officers treated him with a respect that sometimes felt uncomfortable, as if he were somehow different from the man he had been before Dong Xoai. He gave speeches about the battle, conducted interviews, and met with groups of soldiers who wanted to hear about his experiences. Williams handled these responsibilities with the same quiet professionalism he had displayed during the battle itself, never seeking attention but accepting it as part of his duty. In the decades after the war, Williams would reflect on what the Medal of Honor meant to him. He consistently emphasized that it represented the courage of all the men who had fought at Dong Xoai, not just his own actions. He spoke about Marvin Shields frequently, ensuring that people understood the sacrifice the young Seabee had made. Williams attended reunions of Special Forces veterans, met with families of men who had served at Dong Xoai, and worked to ensure that the battle was remembered accurately. He understood that as one of the few survivors who received the Medal of Honor, he had a responsibility to tell the story of what happened that night in June 1965. It was a responsibility he took seriously for the rest of his life. The Battle of Dong Xoai was not fought in isolation. It was part of the larger 1965 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong summer offensive, a coordinated campaign designed to inflict maximum casualties on South Vietnamese forces, and to demonstrate that the Saigon government could not survive without massive American intervention. Throughout May, June, and into July of 1965, Communist forces launched attacks across South Vietnam, targeting district capitals, ARVN units, and American installations. Dong Xoai was simply the most dramatic and costly of these attacks, the one that received the most attention and had the most significant strategic implications. The pattern of the summer offensive was consistent: concentrated attacks by large Viet Cong or North Vietnamese units, designed to overwhelm local defenses before reinforcements could arrive. In some cases, these attacks succeeded completely, with entire ARVN units being destroyed and district capitals being temporarily occupied. In other cases, like Dong Xoai, the attacks inflicted heavy casualties but failed to achieve complete victory. What all these attacks demonstrated was that the enemy had reached a new level of capability. They could mass forces, conduct complex operations, and sustain combat operations at an intensity that exceeded what American planners had anticipated for this stage of the war. The American response to this summer offensive was to dramatically accelerate the deployment of ground combat forces. In July 1965, President Johnson authorized the deployment of additional troops that would bring a total American strength in Vietnam to over 100,000 personnel by the end of the year. This was the turning point, the moment when the Vietnam War truly became an American war rather than a South Vietnamese conflict with American support. The 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, Marine units, and other combat formations began flowing into Vietnam in numbers that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. The doctrine that would govern American operations was also taking shape during this period. General Westmoreland envisioned a strategy of attrition, using American firepower and mobility to find, fix, and destroy enemy forces faster than they could be replaced. The assumption was that the United States could inflict casualties at a rate that would eventually force North Vietnam to negotiate. Operations would focus on search and destroy missions, using helicopters to rapidly insert troops into areas where enemy forces were suspected, engaging in combat, and then extracting before the enemy could mass overwhelming force. It was an approach that relied heavily on the lessons learned from battles like Dong Xoai about the importance of air mobility and fire support. The 118th Aviation Company found itself at the forefront of this new phase of the war. Their experience at Dong Xoai had made them one of the most respected helicopter units in Vietnam, and they were constantly called upon for the most difficult missions. They participated in Operation Attleboro in 1966, one of the largest American operations to that point. They were heavily involved in Operation Cedar Falls in early 1967, a massive effort to clear enemy forces from the Iron Triangle area near Saigon. When Operation Junction City launched in February 1967, the 118th was there, flying troops into landing zones and providing fire support for what would become the largest American operation of the war. Throughout all these operations, the lessons of Dong Xoai remained relevant. The importance of suppressing enemy fire before landing, the need for responsive air support, the value of well-trained door gunners who could engage targets while the helicopter was in motion. All of these tactical principles had been learned or reinforced during that June night in 1965. The 118th's motto, "It shall be done," became famous throughout the Army aviation community. When ground commanders needed helicopters to fly into the most dangerous situations, when weather was bad or the landing zone was hot, when the mission seemed impossible, they called the 118th. And the 118th always answered. The Tet Offensive in January and February 1968 brought the 118th back into sustained heavy combat. The coordinated communist attacks across South Vietnam included assaults on major cities and bases that required intensive helicopter support to repel. The 118th flew missions defending Bien Hoa, Long Binh, and Saigon itself, their aircraft constantly in the air, evacuating casualties, inserting reinforcements, and providing fire support. The Battle of Loc Ninh in October 1967 had already demonstrated the kind of fighting the Tet Offensive would bring, and the 118th's performance during that battle had once again proven their worth. Individual acts of heroism were commonplace, from door gunners who jumped from their aircraft to rescue downed crews to pilots who flew aircraft that should have been grounded due to battle damage. For the Special Forces community, Dong Xoai led to significant changes in how camps were constructed and defended. Fortifications were strengthened with more extensive bunker systems, better communication systems, and improved defensive positions that learned from the vulnerabilities exposed during the battle. The concept of having two separate compounds, as Dong Xoai had, was largely abandoned in favor of concentrated defensive positions that could provide mutual support. Contingency plans for evacuations were developed and rehearsed regularly. The Special Forces never forgot that even the best defenses could be overwhelmed by a determined enemy with sufficient numbers and firepower. The legacy of Dong Xoai extended beyond tactical and operational lessons. It influenced how Americans thought about the war and about the enemy they were fighting. The Viet Cong were no longer dismissed as guerrillas who fought from the shadows. They were recognized as professional soldiers capable of conducting complex operations with discipline and skill. This changed intelligence estimates, operational planning, and ultimately the resources committed to the war. The realization that the enemy was more capable than initially believed contributed to the escalation of American involvement and shaped the conduct of the war for years to come. One of the most significant but often overlooked impacts of Dong Xoai was on the families of the men who fought there. The wives, children, parents, and siblings of the Americans killed or wounded in the battle had to cope with losses that were devastating on a personal level, but that took place in a war that was increasingly controversial at home. For these families, there was no simple narrative of heroism and victory. Their loved ones had fought and died or been wounded in a battle that most Americans had never heard of, in a war whose purpose was being questioned with increasing intensity. The families had to find meaning in their losses, while the broader society debated whether the war itself had meaning. Joan Shields and her daughter Barbara faced this challenge with remarkable grace. They became advocates for recognition of the Seabees' role in combat, ensuring that Marvin's sacrifice was not forgotten as the war dragged on and public attention shifted to other concerns. They attended ceremonies, gave interviews, and maintained connections with other Seabee families. Joan never remarried, choosing instead to honor Marvin's memory through a life dedicated to a service and to keeping his story alive. Barbara grew up with the weight of being the daughter of a Medal of Honor recipient, a distinction that brought both pride and pain as she tried to understand the father she had barely known. The Vietnam War would continue for another decade after Dong Xoai, consuming thousands more American lives and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese lives. The war would expand and intensify before eventually winding down in defeat and withdrawal. But the Battle of Dong Xoai remained one of the key turning points, one of those moments when the trajectory of the conflict shifted. It demonstrated that the advisory mission was insufficient. It accelerated American ground combat deployments. It taught lessons about tactics and capabilities that would shape operations for years. And it produced acts of courage that exemplified the best of American military tradition, even in a war that would become synonymous with controversy and division. More than 5 decades after the Battle of Dong Xoai, the lessons and legacy of that night continue to resonate. The battle has been studied at military schools, analyzed in staff colleges, and examined by historians trying to understand the early escalation of American involvement in Vietnam. The tactical details of the fight, the decisions made under pressure, the courage displayed by ordinary soldiers facing extraordinary circumstances, all of these elements remain relevant to military professionals seeking to understand combat leadership and small unit tactics. Dong Xoai is no longer just a battle that happened in 1965. It has become a case study in courage, a lesson in the fog of war, and a memorial to those who fought and died there. The 118th Aviation Company continued serving in Vietnam until 1972, compiling a record of achievement that made them one of the most decorated helicopter units in the history of Army aviation. They participated in virtually every major operation in the Third Corps area, from the early battles of the escalation phase through the intense fighting of the Tet Offensive and beyond. The unit's history is filled with accounts of heroism and sacrifice, missions completed against impossible odds, and pilots and crew chiefs who refused to abandon soldiers on the ground, no matter the personal cost. But when veterans of the 118th gather at reunions, Dong Xoai remains a touchstone, the battle that tested them early and proved they had what it took to succeed in the most challenging environment imaginable. A UH-1D helicopter, painted in the colors of the 118th Aviation Company's 2nd Platoon, now sits at VFW Post 7991 in Dunalon, Florida, dedicated to those killed or missing at Dong Xoai in 1965. It is a stark reminder of what was lost and what was accomplished. The helicopter is not actually an aircraft that served at Dong Xoai, but its presence serves a symbolic purpose. It allows veterans and civilians alike to see the type of aircraft that flew into combat that day, to understand the fragility of the machines and the courage of the men who flew them. At the American Freedom Museum in Bullard, Texas, another preserved Huey serves a similar function, this one painted with the Bandit II markings and serving as a memorial to the Army aviators who flew into danger repeatedly during the Vietnam War. For the Special Forces community, Dong Xoai remains an important part of their history. The battle demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of the Special Forces mission in Vietnam. It showed that small teams of highly trained American soldiers could work effectively with indigenous forces to create fighting units that would stand and fight even when outnumbered. But it also demonstrated that such camps were vulnerable to large-scale attacks, and that the advisory mission had inherent risks that could not be eliminated no matter how good the training or how strong the fortifications. The Green Berets honor their fallen from Dong Xoai at memorials across the United States, and the battle is taught as part of Special Forces history. The Navy Seabee community has never forgotten Marvin Shields. As the only Seabee to receive the Medal of Honor in any American war, Shields holds a unique place in their history. His story is told to every new Seabee during training, ensuring that each generation understands what their motto, "We build, we fight," truly means. The fact that Shields was a construction mechanic, not a combat engineer, or a specially trained warrior, makes his sacrifice even more meaningful. He was an ordinary man who rose to extraordinary circumstances, and in doing so, he exemplified the best of what the Seabees represent. His guitar, which he had brought to Vietnam and played in the evenings before the battle, has been preserved as a memorial, a poignant reminder of the man behind the hero. In Vietnam itself, Dong Xoai is remembered differently. For the Vietnamese who lived through the war, particularly those in the local area, the battle was a disaster that destroyed their town and killed or displaced thousands of people. The district capital that had been their home was reduced to rubble, and many families never recovered from the losses they suffered. In the post-war period, the battle has been commemorated by the Vietnamese government as a victory over American imperialism, though the heavy casualties suffered by Vietnamese forces on all sides are acknowledged less openly. The physical scars of the battle have long since healed, with new construction replacing what was destroyed, but the memories remain for those who lived through it. For American veterans of the battle, the passage of time has not diminished the intensity of their memories. Those who survived Dong Xoai carry the experience with them always, the sounds and sights and smells of that night etched into their consciousness with a permanence that no amount of time can erase. Some have struggled with post-traumatic stress, wrestling with survivors' guilt, and the psychological impact of experiencing combat at such intensity. Others have found ways to process their trauma through service to other veterans, through storytelling that keeps the memory of fallen comrades alive, and through the bonds they maintain with the men who fought beside them. Charles Williams continued to be involved with veterans organizations and with commemorations of the Battle of Dong Xoai until his death in 2022. He never sought glory or attention for himself, but he recognized that, as a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the most visible survivors of the battle, he had a responsibility to ensure that the story was told accurately and that all the men who fought there were honored. Williams attended numerous ceremonies, spoke at military schools, and met with families of men who had died at Dong Xoai. His dedication to honoring his fellow soldiers never wavered, and his passing marked the end of an era for those who remembered the battle firsthand. The families of those who died at Dong Xoai have their own complex relationship with the battle. For them, it is not a tactical case study or a historical event. It is the moment when their lives changed forever, when they lost fathers, husbands, sons, or brothers. Some families have found meaning in their loss through the recognition that their loved ones died as heroes, fighting for their comrades and their country. Others have struggled with anger and questioning, wondering if the sacrifice was worth it, given how the war ultimately ended. There is no single narrative that captures all these experiences, no simple story that makes sense of such loss. The broader lessons of Dong Xoai extend beyond the immediate military context. The battle illustrated how quickly situations can escalate, how advisory missions can become combat operations, and how limited objectives can expand into major commitments. These lessons are relevant not just to military planners, but to policymakers who make decisions about when and how to commit American forces abroad. Dong Xoai serves as a reminder that once soldiers are engaged in combat, the situation takes on a momentum of its own, and the original strategic calculus may no longer apply. It is a cautionary tale about the difficulty of limited war and the challenges of fighting an enemy on their own terrain. In the years since the battle, numerous books, articles, and documentary films have examined Dong Xoai from various perspectives. Historians have analyzed the decisions made by commanders on both sides. Military analysts have studied the tactics employed by the Viet Cong and the defensive measures taken by the Americans. Journalists have interviewed survivors and family members, piecing together the human stories behind the military statistics. Each of these efforts contributes to a fuller understanding of what happened and why it mattered. The battle continues to be relevant because the questions it raises about courage, leadership, and the nature of warfare remain relevant. On the anniversaries of the battle, particularly the major milestones like the 50th anniversary in 2015, ceremonies have been held to honor those who fought and died at Dong Xoai. These ceremonies bring together veterans, family members, military officials, and historians. They feature speeches that commemorate the sacrifice, honor guards that provide military ceremony, and moments of silence that allow reflection on the cost of war. These gatherings serve multiple purposes. They provide closure for those who need it. They educate younger generations about military history, and they ensure that the sacrifices made at Dong Xoai are not forgotten as the event recedes further into the past. The physical location of the battle, the Dong Xoai district in Phuoc Long province, has changed dramatically since 1965. Modern development has transformed the area, and few physical traces of the battle remain visible. The fortifications have long since been removed, the destroyed buildings replaced, and the landscape altered by decades of peace and economic growth. But for those who fought there, the geography remains frozen in memory, as it was on the June night. The layout of the camp, the positions of defensive bunkers, the open ground between buildings where men died, all of it preserved in the minds of survivors with a clarity that belies the passage of time. The story of Dong Xoai is ultimately a story about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. It is about young Americans who volunteered to serve their country and found themselves in a situation that tested them to the absolute limit of human endurance. It is about Montagnard tribesmen who fought alongside the Americans with loyalty and courage. It is about South Vietnamese soldiers who battled to defend their homeland against an enemy that was determined and skilled. It is about helicopter pilots and crew chiefs who flew into hell to save their fellow soldiers. And it is about an enemy force that fought with discipline and effectiveness, achieving many of their objectives despite heavy losses. As the decades pass and the number of living veterans from the Battle of Dong Xoai continues to decrease, the responsibility for remembering and honoring what happened there falls to new generations. Military historians, students of conflict, and anyone interested in understanding courage under fire will continue to study this battle. The lessons it teaches about leadership, about the fog of war, about the importance of training and morale, about the capabilities required to survive intense combat. All of these lessons remain relevant regardless of when or where the next conflict occurs. Dong Xoai is more than history. It is a teacher, a memorial, and a testament to what soldiers can endure when they have no choice but to fight. The two Medal of Honor recipients from the battle, Charles Williams and Marvin Shields, represent different aspects of the American military experience, but share the common thread of selfless service. Williams, who survived his wounds and lived to tell the story, carried the burden of representing all who fought at Dong Xoai for over 5 decades. Shields, who died from his wounds but maintained his spirit and courage until the end, represented the ultimate sacrifice and the willingness to give everything for comrades and mission. Together, their stories capture what the battle was about, not tactics or strategy or policy, but human beings doing their duty in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The Battle of Dong Xoai was one of hundreds of engagements fought during the Vietnam War, but it holds a special place in military history because of what it represented and what it foreshadowed. It was fought at the cusp of major American escalation, serving as both a catalyst for that escalation and an example of what that escalation would require. It demonstrated the courage of American servicemen while also illustrating the challenges they would face in the years ahead. It produced heroes whose actions inspired their comrades and whose sacrifices earned the nation's highest honors. And it remains, more than half a century later, a powerful reminder of the price of war and the valor of those who fight. As we remember the Battle of Dong Xoai, we honor not just those who were there, but all who have served in combat. We recognize that the qualities displayed at Dong Xoai, courage, leadership, loyalty, and sacrifice, are timeless military virtues that transcend any particular conflict. We acknowledge the families who paid the price of their loved ones' service, who endured loss and carried grief while supporting the mission and honoring the memory of the fallen. And we commit ourselves to ensuring that the lessons of battles like Dong Xoai are never forgotten, that future generations of military leaders and policymakers understand what is asked of soldiers when they are committed to combat. The night the jungle burned at Dong Xoai, when 2,000 Viet Cong soldiers assaulted a camp defended by a handful of Americans and their local allies, produced a 14-hour battle that changed the course of a war. From the opening mortar barrage at 11:30 p.m. on June 9, 1965, through the desperate last stand at the district headquarters building, through the dramatic helicopter rescue on the afternoon of June 10th, and into the chaotic relief operations that followed, the Battle of Dong Xoai was a crucible that tested everyone involved. Some did not survive that test. Others were forever changed by it. But all who fought there, whether they received medals or not, whether they lived or died, whether their names are remembered or forgotten, all of them earned a place in the proud history of American arms, and in the story of a war that defined a generation.